mental health. It's such a prevalent and commonly talked about topic in our society, but the church never talks about it. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in individuals between the ages of 10 and 34. So why isn't the church talking about it more? And more specifically, why aren't leaders in the church talking about it more? Because whether you might see it or not, leaders struggle with stress, anxiety, and even depression, but you never know it because they don't talk about it. So first, before we dive into this, I want to ask two questions. But first, can I get a volunteer to come write some answers up on the board for us?
Sure.
Thank you, Maddie. I have a pen right here for you. So the first question I have for you guys is, when you think about the phrase mental health problems, what are some of the first things that pop into your mind?
Schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia. Awesome.
I don't know how to spell that stuff.
Do your best. That's all right.
Depression and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Even like triggers of mental health problems.
PTSD.
Abuse. Emotional and physical.
Are there any others before we move on to our next question? Okay, next question. When you think of a church leader, a pastor, worship leader, any kind of leader in the church, what are some of the tasks, responsibilities, and even problems that you think leaders might have to deal with on a weekly basis?
Counseling people?
Counseling? Definitely.
Sermon prep?
The pressure of being in the spotlight.
Absolutely.
Overseeing everything.
That's a good one.
Coordinating events.
Absolutely.
I think just relational skills.
Definitely.
Not allowing their work to fully affect their emotional health.
Mm-hmm.
Taking other people's burdens upon themselves.
Definitely. That's a big one.
Having to consider like family, wife, husband, kids outside of everything else that they have to worry about as well.
Any others before we move on?
I don't think so.
Cool. That's an awesome list. Well, for this first question, I just wanted to kind of get some ideas out there of what mental health problems can look like. Thank you, Maddie. You can have a seat. Mental health is a huge problem in our society. It's very talked about, and it's even become this crutch that people lean on, but the church doesn't talk about it, and that's kind of what I want to dig into today. Now, we're going to keep the answers for the second question in the back of our minds, and I'll get to them in a little bit. So first of all, I want you guys to understand that I'm not making a blanket statement saying that every single leader struggles with depression, anxiety, stress. Some of them may not, but I feel like you'd be surprised at how many are struggling with this. I'm pretty new to the idea, honestly, of mental health. I've always known that people struggle with stress, anxiety, and depression. I've even struggled with some of those things myself. But what I didn't think about was how much church leaders struggle with these things. What really sparked this in my head was when a pastor named Wesley Town came to speak to our D groups, or our D time, a couple of weeks ago. Wesley Town is the church planter of a church called Ecclesia Church up in Redmond, Oregon. Now his church grew so fast and so quickly, and he found himself completely overwhelmed by the feelings of stress, anxiety, and even depression to a degree. There were just so many responsibilities that he was facing as a new pastor of this church. This topic of mental health in church leaders just comes up over and over again over the last couple of weeks, And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I believe that God is putting this on the hearts of leaders in this generation so that they can become a catalyst for change, so that this is a topic we can talk about more freely in the church.
That's good.
So there's a few points that I want to make. One of the reasons that people are so unaware that leaders are struggling with stress and anxiety is simply because leaders don't open up about it. Leaders don't feel safe, don't feel the freedom to talk about their struggles with mental health. Now, I think one of the biggest factors of this is the concept of perfection that leaders place on themselves. Leaders constantly are wanting to strive for perfection, but when in reality, perfection is just not real. The pursuit of perfection is going to become exhausting a lot quicker than you might think. Now, people place their leaders up on these pedestals, and I think that kind of motivates leaders for perfection. To a degree, I think we are pursuing perfection, but in a God-honoring way. We are to pursue to be holy as God is holy, but that can often result in this idea of self-glorification, and that just puts way too much pressure on one person. The second point I want to make is that there's just such a weight on the leaders in the church on their shoulders. Now, some leaders might have grasped the concept that perfection is not necessarily the goal. Perfection is not relatable. Their congregation cannot relate to a person who is striving for perfection because we're human, and the reality is we're not perfect. So I think that some of the reasons that leaders might not feel safe to share is that they think people will be disappointed in them, they will have failed as a leader, and even that maybe stress and anxiety and all of these mental health struggles is sinful. And one thing that I want to just really emphasize is that this is not sinful behavior. It's what we do with these emotions and feelings that becomes sinful. So instead of pulling away when our leaders start to share with us their struggles with mental health, stress, anxiety, we need to lean into them, pour into them, because they are so diligent in pouring into us that we forget that they need to be poured into as well. Now, this is the point that I have been most excited to make because it has truly shifted my perspective on how I live my life. Something that Wesley Town said, as well as the college pastor here at Bayside, said multiple times in a week, was that leaders need to understand the difference between carrying and caring for someone. The reality is we were not created or designed to carry everyone's burdens, but I think that's what a lot of leaders find themselves doing. Now we look at this list. Leaders face counseling, sermon prep, pressure of being in the spotlight, work and emotional health. Those are so intertwined. You're not able to work your best when your emotional and mental health is going down the drain. So there's all these things that they face, but I think one of the biggest one is people's burdens. They face the weight of people's burdens. And the reality is, Jesus was the one designed to carry those. It says in Matthew 11:28 that Jesus provides rest. He says, "Come to me, all of you whose burdens are heavy, and I will give you rest." So leaders' jobs is simply to come alongside the people who are hurting and care for them as Jesus carries them. That is something that has truly shifted my perspective, and I believe that leaders need to grasp that concept if they are able to overcome these feelings of burden. Now, the last point before I want to just give you some practical tips on how to overcome stress and anxiety is one that you probably will think like, duh, Julia, of course leaders need that. But I'm going to say it anyway. Leaders need community. Leaders are so diligent in cultivating community for those around them that they get lost in the fact that they need community too. We were not created to live life alone, and we were not created to bottle everything up inside and bear it on our own. So it's really that simple. Leaders need community. And I think that we have a responsibility to the leaders around us to make sure that we are creating a safe space for leaders to share their struggles, to share the struggles that they're having with stress and anxiety. Now, a few practical tips before we end. They are not the only tips that will help battle stress and anxiety, but they are the ones that I have found to be the most helpful in my life personally. Left unchecked, your mental health problems will destroy your health physically, emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. It's not something that you can just push to the side and focus on all the tasks in front of you. You have to prioritize your mental and emotional health. So the first tip I want to give you is that it's really helpful to learn what triggers your stress and anxiety. Learning what triggers, maybe what problems, maybe even certain people or situations that trigger that stress and anxiety will be so helpful as you're learning how to manage that. Now, as leaders, we don't always have the option to avoid those situations, but it will really help if you have an advanced knowledge of what triggers that, so you're not left in that moment feeling totally caught off guard by what triggers those things. Because the worst feeling is when you are overcome with anxiety and stress all of a sudden and you have no clue what triggered it. Now, the second tip I want to give you is that we need to learn when and how to rest. We live in this world that is constantly moving and going. There's so many options, so many choices that we have to make. That's this constant stimulus inside of our brains that just goes and goes and goes. Now, for leaders, it can feel really hard to escape and just take the time to rest because they have so many tasks, like these ones here, that they are facing on a daily basis. But even if it's not complete silence and solitude, just taking 5 to 10 minutes of your day just to focus on yourself and Jesus really helps to reset your mind in a way that can help you battle stress and anxiety. Now, the last tip that I want to give you is that it is okay to ask for help. This is probably one of the most simple things that I can tell you, but people have the hardest time doing it. You will not be a failure if you ask for help. You're not going to disappoint people, and you'll still be a good leader. In fact, you're going to be an even better leader if you seek help early on instead of letting it get to this point where it's destroying your health. That help can simply look like going to a friend, just sharing the things that are on your mind, processing things. It doesn't have to be professional help, but it's okay if it is. Going to a counselor, to a therapist, those are people that are trained to help you get to the root of the things that are causing your mental, emotional, and spiritual mental health problems. So remember, it is not your job to carry everyone's burdens. It is your job to walk alongside of them and care for them as Jesus carries the weight of those burdens. I want to encourage you with 2 things before we finish. First of all, instead of letting fear and anxiety, stress, depression, instead of letting those things overtake your mind and control your every action, I want you to remember that the peace and the presence of God is always with you. That is a reality. It's not a feeling that you feel when you are having a good day. The presence of God and the peace of God is a fact, and it is something that is always around you. Lastly, I want to encourage you, when the weight of everything of your responsibilities hits you, remember that it's okay to ask for help. Go to your community of people that are willing to encourage you and be a safe space for you to share those struggles. I hope this has encouraged you and enlightened you to a little bit of the struggles that leaders face on a daily basis with mental health. And I hope that this encourages you to be a safe place for your leaders to come to and talk to. And if a lot of you are leaders, which I think we are in this school, we're all being trained as leaders, know that it's okay to have these struggles, but be willing to share about it, because you never know what your story of brokenness might do to help someone else heal. Thank you, guys.